A month or so ago, Adam Looney came to me and said, we're doing a panel on the history of airline deregulation, and I understand that you had something to do with Hawaiian Airlines. Could you help? And so at that point, I said yes, and didn't bother to tell him that this is a subject that I'd been following, working on since I was in graduate school. And you've already met Nancy and her background. Calling Dorothy Robine a non-resident senior fellow with the Institute for Sustainable Energy is, in my view, a gross injustice. I had my first discussion with Dorothy about whether air traffic control systems were better done within government or within a private thing in 1993. And she has served with distinction in the White House and the National Economic Council and the Department of Defense, and has dealt with transportation issues of various kinds in the airline system ever since. Kathy runs the part of the antitrust division that worries about transportation competition. That gives her both extraordinary leverage and some important limitations. And one of the things I want to be very explicit about is, because Kathy is a sitting government official who is actively involved in any determination that the government makes with regard to anything in the airline sector, we're not going to ask her about who shot John when American was allowed to merge with U.S. Airways. We're not going to ask her what's currently on the schedule, et cetera. And so you'll have to draw whatever inferences you can from her discussion in general about this. I'd like to start, if I may, by letting Dorothy and Kathy amplify the question that Nancy already started with, which is, looking back at deregulation, how do you evaluate it? What surprised you, et cetera?
All right. And let me start by saying that I did my dissertation on trucking deregulation, and so I came along about a year after airline deregulation had passed and was a fly on the wall watching to see whether this incredibly good idea, namely trucking deregulation, which economists had been pushing, could actually get through Congress. In the course of that, doing my dissertation, I discovered Nancy's senior thesis at Harvard on trucking deregulation in the Harvard Library, and so we met many, many years ago. And so I look at airline deregulation through that lens as well. I think I very much agree. I thought Nancy was subdued in her comments. I am more, maybe because I am used to talking to non-academic audiences, and because there's controversy about it. I am more exuberant. I think it has been a resounding success for consumers. The decline in price, the increase in opportunity in service, in flights, and options, the criticism and many Democrats who supported deregulation and consumer groups, I hope we'll talk about this later, have recanted. And I think that has to do with the decline in quality of service. That is predictable. It's due largely to the increase in load factor from 55% to 85%. Overall, I think airlines are giving passengers what they consistently indicate that they want, which is lower fares at the expense of service. So I think it is not too much of an exaggeration to say that the back of the plane is brought to you by airline deregulation. It's that 45% of the seats that were sitting empty. I think if for passengers who complain about the quality of the service, you can pay business fare and you will be you can get the comforts of flying pre-1978, and you will be paying about what you would have paid to fly coach absent deregulation. So can we talk about surprises separately? I'd rather.
Sure.
Okay, all right, why don't you?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Kathy ONeill. Thanks very much for the nice introduction. I just need to start off by saying that the views that I shared this morning are really my views and don't necessarily represent the views of the Antitrust Division. Probably as the most junior panelist, I did not bear witness to the regulated era in the same way as some of my fellow panelists. But just to say that having been at DOJ for 12 years and practiced in antitrust before that, I'm obviously a huge fan of competition, unfettered competition, and I love to see how competition evolves in the airline sector in general.
So talk about the surprises.
Well, so I'm going to.
This was a good generic idea, i.e. allow access, lower fares, et cetera. But the responses of the industry were not anything that, as far as I can tell, anyone anticipated at the time. They thought that fares would go down. They didn't predict hubs. They didn't predict frequent flyer programs. They didn't predict the disruption of unions or extensive consolidation in the industry, et cetera. So what surprised?
I want to answer that question in a slightly different way. I will leave it to Nancy to talk about the business operational kinds of things. That price elasticity of demand was higher than the CAB had always assumed that it was. The fare dispersion was unexpectedly high. All those kinds of things. I want to talk about two other. I think looking back on it, spillover benefits that people didn't expect or expect the magnitude of the impact. One is international. Deregulation enabled or forced airlines to be more competitive. That positioned them better for international competition. And U.S. government officials very quickly began negotiating away bilateral restrictions, capitalizing on the advantage of U.S. airlines. And that began a whole new thrust in airline competition. And foreign carriers were forced to privatize. Most of them, almost all of them, were state-owned. They began to privatize with British Airways in 1983. And so the whole push in the international area was, I think, to some degree, an unexpected surprise of airline deregulation. Also, following up on what Nancy said, the deregulation in trucking paved the way, laid the groundwork for deregulation of a whole series of other transportation and non-transportation industries. Trucking deregulation would not have happened absent airline deregulation. It was a conscious strategy by the Carter administration to take on airline deregulation first because trucking, the most obvious other candidate, had even fiercer political opposition. I don't think you mentioned this, but airline deregulation is remarkable because it was done over the opposition of the regulated airline industry and the trade unions. That's normally a formula for political defeat of policy reform. So the idea was that trucking deregulation, where you're going up against the even more powerful trucking industry and the Teamsters, would be even harder. So let's try to do airlines first. If we succeed there, then let's take on trucking. And then, as Nancy said, railroads followed, intercity buses, natural gas, brokerage fees, telecommunications evolved much more slowly. It began with airlines. When Alfred Kahn when he got the call from the White House asking him if he would chair the Civil Aeronautics Board, he said, he asked if he could chair the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, instead. That was the job that he really wanted. He had been chairing the New York Public Service Commission. He knew a lot about telecommunications. He didn't know anything about airlines. He once referred to airlines as marginal costs with wings. And he didn't view it as his highest aspiration for rich people to be able to fly around the world at lower fares on airplanes given the energy crisis. So he wanted to be chairman of the FCC, and Jimmy Carter said, I want you at the CAB because it is going to start here. It's going to start with airlines, and indeed, that is where it began, this huge movement.
Let's talk about, before we get to the international questions, let's talk about the state of competition now. In other words, airline deregulation allowed fare flexibility, allowed access. There have been lots of changes in the structure of the industry, hub and spoke, some consolidation, some new entrants, et cetera. So I'd like to start, Kathy, by asking you, to the extent that you can without violating the department's guidelines, to talk a little bit about what's the current role of antitrust? How do you think about competitive questions? Are they limited to mergers versus not? Or are there other practices that you can undertake to spur competition?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk to that. Starting first with just a little bit of an overview of how we analyze mergers, recognizing that each transaction, presents its own set of facts and idiosyncratic problems for us to analyze. In general, when we look at airline mergers, we look first for overlaps. We look at whether the merger and where the merger is likely to eliminate head-to-head competition between the carriers on nonstop routes, on connecting routes. We look at how the merger is likely to affect concentration at congested airports. For instance, in American US Air, we were very concerned about how the merger might impact concentration levels at DCA. We also look at system-wide theories of harm. So, for instance, we examine whether the merger would result in the elimination of a particularly disruptive air carrier, what we in the antitrust lingo like to call a maverick. Would it involve the elimination of an airline that's more likely to discount or less likely to follow a fare increase? That's something that we would study and that would give us pause. We also look at whether there's likely to be increased coordination through enhanced multi-market contacts. So what I'm thinking about here, just the general idea, is that firms that interact in multiple markets are more likely to pull their competitive punches and accommodate each other on price and on capacity rather than engage in full-throated competition. And if a merger has the potential to enhance the overlaps, and here I'm thinking about or enhance the contacts. Here I'm thinking about the contacts not between the two merging parties, but between either of the merging parties and the remaining competitors in the market. If it's likely to align incentives in a way that the merged firm is more likely to accommodate rather than to compete with the remaining carriers, that's something that we're going to look at and that could give us pause. We also look at whether the merger is likely to enhance coordination on ancillary fees. As Nancy was saying earlier, there's been a real proliferation in those fees. They're often set at the system level. And so we're thinking about whether one of the airlines has been historically more disruptive in not following or imposing fees and how the merger might change the incentives. So that's a little bit how we look at mergers. We also look at conduct. Just under the Sherman Act, Section 1 and Section 2. Section 1, we're looking at anti-competitive agreements. Section 2, we're looking for exclusionary conduct or monopolization. But to just take up anti-competitive agreements, one area of focus more recently is public signaling behavior. So in certain industries, and I think airlines is an example of this, we're seeing an uptick in public statements, in earnings calls, and other public speeches that appear to be aimed more at competitors and less at investors. And there's a concern that market participants may be using their public statements or the public dialogue or some combination of public and private communications to reach an agreement on capacity or price. This is obviously concerning to us, and just because these statements are being made publicly doesn't mean that we can't pursue them under the antitrust laws. Courts have recognized that public statements and announcements can serve as circumstantial evidence of an anti-competitive agreement that's actionable under Section 1. Antitrust scholars have made similar observations. And so that's sort of one area of focus. Another feature of many industries, and the airline industry is no exception to this, extensive common ownership across the market participants can be a flag for us and cause us to look a bit more closely. So common ownership in an industry will raise the possibility of active efforts to coordinate the actions of competitors by or through the common owners. The concern is that the common owners could be playing a role in facilitating an anti-competitive agreement on price or capacity. So there's an increased focus on that type of public signaling behavior. At the same time, I need to acknowledge that those types of antitrust cases are challenging to put together from an evidentiary standpoint, those types of cases, because I don't have the direct communication between the CEOs of the company setting price or setting capacity, rely more on circumstantial evidence. But we are concerned about it, and we will be scrutinizing it. I think, just to follow up on that, for this type of behavior, I would offer some thoughts about how you can, as a market participant or an investor or industry analyst, avoid sort of stepping over the line. Firms, just generally should be very cautious about making public statements about future capacity levels or pricing. In particular, public statements urging the industry or other competitors to exercise capacity restraint or offering something that could be viewed as a quid pro quo. So I'd be willing to reduce capacity if you would. I'm amenable to this if others follow. That type of contingency articulated publicly is the type of thing that is going to raise red flags for regulators and for those of us in the antitrust division. Obviously, firms need to be careful about sharing non-public information about capacity or pricing with investors and industry analysts, because there's a temptation then to share that for those common owners, to share that information across firms, and that could result in liability not only for the market participants, but for the common owners themselves. There hasn't been a case on that, but there's definitely scrutiny of it.
Kathy, can I add?
Yes.
In 2003, I was appointed trustee and ran Hawaiian Airlines. And Hawaiian Airlines and the other major domestic carrier, which was Aloha, it no longer exists, had engaged in basically price competition that it turned out neither of them could afford. So one of the challenges I had was, how do we raise prices? I didn't have to talk to anyone at Aloha. I just went around Hawaii making speeches that unless fares went up, Hawaiian Airlines was gonna disappear. That's all I did. Mm-hmm. And then we raised prices and watched and saw what the other folks did, which is they raised prices too. Mm-hmm. These days, all prices we can get online. So in a world in which every carrier knows every current fare from every other carrier, how do you think about price competition in that kind of situation?
So one of the reasons that we worry about these statements, and airlines in particular, is an industry that has characteristics that lend itself to coordination, is just because there is so much transparency on price and capacity that already exists. So you can make the argument that you don't have to get together the CEOs in a smoke-filled room to reach the collusive agreement, because there's a lot of information out there, and with some additional public dialogue that offers some sort of a contingency, I'll do this if you do this and I'll do that, it's possible to reach a collusive outcome without actually having the traditional cartel setting. But the result, from a competition standpoint, is still troubling, notwithstanding the fact that the dialogue played out in part publicly. Is that helpful?
Yeah,
Say,
please.
my recollection, but you lived it, so you can tell me, there was a very interesting paper on the Hawaiian experience that first started with the exemption from the antitrust laws after 9/11 for the intra-Hawaiian traffic, where the carriers were allowed to not just, were legally allowed to do what Kathy's worried about.
Yes.
Sit down, talk about capacity, talk about pricing, and then that evaporated, and the fares stayed very high.
No, they went up.
They went, you're right, they went up because of the, and also because of the elimination of coupons, right?
No, because we raised them. In other words,
But you eliminated, I thought there was an elimination of discounts.
yes.
Yes, and yes, okay. Until there was an entrant, right? So at some point, 2 or 3 years later, a new entrant came into the market.
No, it was, this gets to the nub of the difficulty that Kathy's talking about, which is in an industry in which the product prices are public.
Right.
Public. You don't have to meet in a room. You can engage in signaling behavior publicly. So I arrived at Hawaiian when the antitrust exemption was ending.
Right.
And so the question was, what would prices be? My response was, they were losing money at the current price levels with the current price structure. And so I knew that prices had to go up. The question was, without the ability to coordinate capacity, what would happen? Hence, making a lot of speeches. And then, I can't remember whether it was the day after the antitrust exemption ended, I wanted to be very clear that this was not being done under an antitrust exemption. We raised prices. We raised prices according to the old structure, which was basically, if you flew from Honolulu to the next island over, which was a 30-mile hop, or if you flew from Honolulu to the Big Island, which was a 300-mile hop, it was the same price. The pricing system was developed on a bus system model, et cetera. So one of the things we did is we raised prices, and then we started price differentiating, and that was gradually adopted by the other major carrier, which, by the way, was also in financial distress, also went into bankruptcy, and ultimately died because they didn't succeed.
But Joshua, that was post 9/11 when there was this dramatic fall off in tourism. So you can say the airlines in Hawaii were hurting, but how much of that was suddenly it had become an industry that couldn't sustain itself, and how much was the industry is very susceptible to demand fluctuations, GDP level or tourism fluctuations in an area like Hawaii?
We should bring that question back when Richard Anderson is on, because in my experience, what businesses have to do is they have to figure out how to maintain some level of profitability when demand goes up and down, and they have some costs which are fixed and some costs which are not fixed, et cetera, and they do so. The challenge that Kathy has is that part of the pricing is so public that.
Well, and Kathy didn't mention it, but the division had a collusion case based on communication through the Airline Tariff Publishing Bureau,
Yes.
Which is where the airlines would submit their fare basis codes and their fares and use that to communicate, hey, this price war is just because Josh has done something I don't like, don't respond to it, or Kathy's really out of line, I'm going to put Kathy's airline code at the end of my fare, and we're all going to go lower fares against her until she comes back in line. So the industry's got a history of this.
Now, let me ask you a question, Dorothy. I don't think I can ask it of Kathy, but how do you assess the quality of competition in the industry, in the domestic industry right now? In other words, we have fewer than a couple of dozen carriers than we had 30 years ago, so we've had some consolidation. We have the price signaling conundrum that we've just talked about. In your view,
You're asking me? Yeah.
or asking you, I'm asking
Okay.
Nancy.
I think it looks strong. So I'm not tracking airlines day to day the way I did for a long time. But looking at studies that have been done, at the industry charts and so forth, it looks strong. And I'll cite maybe the single best piece of evidence. The guy who should be here today on this panel is Cliff Winston, who sits upstairs and has been upstairs for 35 years doing the definitive work on airline deregulation. Just absolutely phenomenal work, and is having back surgery today. So couldn't, even though he planned this and has been looking forward to it for months, couldn't be here. So Cliff has long thought that we should allow cabotage as one way to increase competition. That is, to allow a foreign carrier to carry traffic, that purely domestic traffic. So Norwegian Air brings passengers from Bergen to Minneapolis, they should then be allowed to carry traffic from Minneapolis to Des Moines. And that is not possible. Cabotage is not possible anywhere. So Cliff did his usual very elaborate econometric study of what would be the benefits from cabotage if you allowed, and he looked carefully at the impact of low-cost carriers in Europe and the impact of low-cost carriers in the United States, and the impact on fares, and concluded it was around 25% reduction in fares here, and something similar in Europe. So what if you let European low-cost carriers into all the routes that don't have low-cost competition from Southwest or another low-cost carrier in the United States? That number turned out to be surprisingly small. Cliff was surprised. Benefits to consumers, $1.6 billion a year. Why? Because on 80% of the routes, you had competition from Southwest or another low-cost carrier. That has been the key to the success of airline deregulation all along. For a long time, it was Southwest, the Southwest effect. Now you've got Frontier, Spirit, Allegiant. David Neeleman, who created JetBlue, is coming along with something else. I think it is good. I think the key is maintaining low-cost competition. And the FAA froze after the value jet crash in the mid-90s. I was in the White House then. Mort Downey was at DOT. Horrible crash. The FAA stopped letting in new entrants, and you could, within 3 or 4 years, you could see the effect. You did not have as much low-cost competition, and you began to have pricing issues with the legacy carriers. So I think it's strong, but it depends. Competition is strong, but it depends on the continued growth of low-cost carriers.
Nancy?
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo that. You saw that, when I showed you the expansion of market share by low-cost carriers, which took a long time to get up to the level that it's at now. I said that was super important to the industry, and I totally agree with Dorothy. I think that is fundamental to the competitiveness of airline markets. I think what goes along with that are a couple of other things. So one is access to particularly capacity-constrained airports. Right now we have a system where, particularly at slot-constrained airports, operations-constrained airports, but also at some others with respect to gate access, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, for a new entrant to come in and get a toehold. And the FAA operates a system that's got a lot of incumbency inertia in it, which further makes it more difficult. I think that's an incredibly important thing to worry about. Kathy and I worked together on the United Slots case at Newark, and maybe she'd like to talk about that. But I think it's not just enough to say low-cost carriers are good. We've got to actively do what we can to promote their access to enter new markets. And I would also say to take a pretty skeptical view at this point forward of any additional consolidation, particularly if it should involve a carrier that's business model is more low price.
So just to pick up, Nancy, on one of your points, and Nancy's right, we worked on a case together back in 2015. United was proposing to acquire additional slots from Delta at Newark Airport. At the time, United already had the dominant position by far at the airport. They held 73% of the slots. They were seeking to acquire additional slots from Delta, and we brought a lawsuit seeking to enjoin that transaction. We actually alleged a monopolization claim as part of our lawsuit. They had 73% of the share. United not only sat on the biggest share, but they were underutilizing and hoarding what they had. So one data point that we had in our complaint was that on any given day, United chose not to use as many as 82 slots, which was more than any other airline had the ability to fly at the airport. Our concern was that allowing United to acquire even more slots would have further fortified their monopoly position at that airport. So I mention this because, to pick up on Nancy's point, we are at the Antitrust Division very focused on these slot-controlled and gate-constrained airports. LCCs have been a really important component of competition in the deregulated era, but there are these intractable entry barriers. So looking for ways through antitrust enforcement in the case of the slots case at Newark Airport, but also regulatory reform that focuses on reducing those or removing those entry barriers so that LCCs can get in there and actually compete. And just to briefly tout the benefits of that one case. So we sued, and then on the eve of trial, the FAA actually announced that it was going to lift slot controls at the airport, which was an amazing thing. So they did lift slot controls in, I think it was October 2016. And it's been that's been really impactful for low-cost carriers and for consumers flying in and out of Newark. I saw one metric recently that the average fare at Newark Airport is down on order of 12%, was down on order of 12% in Q1 of 2017 as compared to Q1 of 2016, and that's across the airport. It was down more significantly on the routes where LCCs actually were able to enter and begin providing service. So just that decision has actually unleashed meaningful competition at the airport. I think at the division, we definitely are looking at those slot transactions and focusing especially on at airports like Newark, where you have a very dominant carrier seeking to enhance its position.
This provides the perfect segue for a discussion about the effect of this on the rest of the system. In other words, Nancy, you put up the slide that shows that ASMs increased, available seat miles, departures increased, yes. Passengers increased, et cetera. So this unleashed a lot of demand.
Yes. So,
and then the question is, Dorothy, yes.
So I want to invoke Fred Kahn again.
But let me just lay out the question for those who don't know how long you've been working at this, is once we allow for more demand, that puts strains on the system,
right,
in terms of airport capacity, in terms of air traffic capacity, et cetera. And even though, Dorothy, you want to talk, I know, about the air traffic control system.
No, I'm going to talk about airports.
Yes,
first.
but let us start with, what's the effect of this on airports?
Yeah. So I'm going to invoke Fred Kahn again, many times this morning. But on the eve of deregulation, March of 1978, Fred spoke at an FAA conference. He had been talking frequently, corresponding with the FAA about what was going on, and he said, and the FAA, he was already starting to deregulate administratively. Traffic was starting to go up, and the FAA was freaking out, and they were saying, "Whoa, we don't know how to handle all this traffic. Can't you do something about this? Can't you coordinate the flow? Can't you let the carriers get together and coordinate?" And he gave this speech, and he said, "We are trying to introduce market principles, market forces in this industry, and the last thing I am going to do is rely on an administrative mechanism to reduce traffic. We're unleashing enormous demand for air travel and indirectly for infrastructure, and you guys need to respond on the supply side, the infrastructure supply side." And specifically what he meant was, you need to abandon your policy, which he considered perverse of, and I agree, of weight-based landing fees. So charging for landing, aircraft landing based on the weight of the aircraft. And replacing that with congestion pricing, with a charge that recognized that there will be times of day when the runways are in great demand and aircraft should have to pay more at that time of day than off-peak periods. And he said at that conference, what if we priced everything that comes out of a cow at a uniform price per pound? And he said at another point later, we have no hesitation in other markets about letting price rise to equate supply and demand of scarce goods. Why should runway capacity be any different? Suppose we charge for oil paintings by the pound. You'd have not just congestion, but riots at the art dealers selling Van Gogh paintings.
And Fred's suggestion became the uniform practice in the nation?
Yes, so the FAA completely ignored his recommendation, which he later expanded to include efficient pricing of airways and also spinning the air traffic control system off. So we are, and we still use, the DOT in 2008 did allow for a limited form of congestion pricing. No airport has taken advantage of that new policy. And I honestly don't know to what degree that is because the policy is actually not that liberal, because there is a lot of airline resistance to congestion pricing. The airlines capture the scarcity rents from flights at congested periods. So if you impose congestion pricing, that shifts some of those rents from the airline to the airport. So there has been longstanding resistance from airlines to congestion pricing. When I was here as a guest scholar, I wrote an op-ed in favor of congestion pricing and got attacked by the Airline Trade
So in addition to
Association.
pricing,
Yeah.
did airports increase capacity?
Yeah, no, no. I mean, we're kind of stuck where we are, and so we have very irrational, from an economic standpoint, pricing of the scarce resource in the aviation industry, runways and airways, and I think gates are now almost as much of an issue as runways. And that has been a real limitation on the growth under deregulation.
Talk a little bit about
Air
capacity in airports and capacity in the air traffic control system. At some point, you can advertise your.
Yeah. So I've been. Josh is referring to this. We had this conversation 25 years ago, 25 years ago, about spinning off air traffic control. Mort and I worked on this. We tried to do this in the Clinton administration. The air traffic control system is not inherently governmental. The regulatory part of the FAA, that's inherently governmental. That's safety regulation. The bulk of what the FAA does, 35,000 employees, 500 towers, and et cetera, is keep planes safely separated. That is not inherently governmental. We tried in the Clinton administration to spin that off as a government corporation. The rest of the world, we were one of the few at the time looking at that policy option. The rest of the world has now gone that way. We have not. We were defeated, and an even more serious effort to do this last year was defeated. So we are laggards when it comes to infrastructure, the infrastructure policy accompanying airline deregulation. Airline deregulation, the part that has been governed by the private sector, very successful. The part that the government controls, the infrastructure, has been a laggard.
Other comments, or should we? I want to go back to a point that you made, Nancy. I want to talk in general about consumer protection. The old Civil Aeronautics Board protected consumers against low prices and against overcrowding. That problem has been solved. The question is, we now have a new generation of consumer complaints. The Congress of the United States legislated and said that in the future, United Airlines could not deplane a passenger after that person had been put in. There are complaints, even from, ironically, non-economist Brookings fellows, that the current system, because of its pricing, is abusive of consumers, that they are. So talk a little bit, it'd be interesting, about consumer, but what degree of consumer protection, if any, is needed beyond what is currently there?
So this isn't an area that I have followed particularly closely. I would say I think airlines have kind of shot themselves in the foot, and many times with respect to some of these issues. They are fundamentally a consumer service or company. You know, they're providing transportation, but they've got this very close interface with consumers who cede a lot of autonomy, all autonomy and control when they basically walk through the TSA screen. And that, I think, also, research has shown, suggests that people get more tense and fraught when you don't feel you've got much agency or control. So I think some of the issues that we've seen and that now get amplified in social media are ones that the companies, it's in the company's self-interest to have avoided those. I'm not quite sure why it seems to take them so long to get to it. So I'm thinking about things like the forcibly deplaning passengers or some of the other aspects of that. I'm more interested in some of the stuff that's come under the consumer protection rubric, but is more focused on pricing with respect to ancillary fees, where I think that's less it's consumer protection, I suppose, in a way, but I'm concerned that what we're seeing is a suppression of competition by pushing more of the revenue into these various fees, started with cancellation fees, which I think are really just a way of enforcing the price discrimination regime, and I don't have a tremendous amount of problem with that per se, as long as you know what you're getting. Moving into the baggage fees, again, maybe not a lot of concern about the checked bag fees if they're disclosed, but there's this pushback by the industry to prevent transparency or disclosure that I think should immediately get you asking why. And my concern is that the why is we compete a little too aggressively if it's clear to passengers that this low ticket price that we're advertising isn't really what it's going to cost them to fly.
Let me push back a little bit.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I bought a car. You have some nominal transparency about what various models will cost, and then you go in and they talk about options. And there are dozens of options. There are so many options, in fact, that people are getting confused, and there are options packages. So you have low, medium, and high option, roughly equivalent to, say, economy, business first, et cetera. But the point is, there are lots of choices. It is not at all transparent because you don't see what the various options cost until you are sitting in the showroom and have already picked a car. So at least as regards airlines, when I click and say I want to go from Washington to Chicago on Airline X, I get the price. They then say, do you want to pay for bags, et cetera. It seems to me that that is more transparent than what's going on in the auto industry.
I'm not sure we'd want to hold up the consumer pricing of automobiles as a model, right? And in part because they may tell you what those options are priced at, but I think relatively few people are expecting they're going to pay the list price of the options on a car. So there's a whole other layer of complexity there. As I said, I don't know that I'd want to hold that up as a model of, as a standard for the rest of the economy. I think the issue with air travel is in part, right, you're purchasing a contract for carriage, and that contract is coming with a lot of pieces that you're not, perhaps, aren't apparent to you. And it's less that whether the airline wants to disclose it or not, it's the airlines are actively, my sense is, actively discouraging or in some cases impeding, say, search engines from disclosing that information or not providing them with the access to it. And so, you know, just if you think about a car purchase, when my husband recently purchased a new car, he went online and got all of the information online about what the various option packages were at dealer cost, at list, and so forth. I think if you had a situation where companies, let's just take airlines, are impeding access to that information, we might be concerned about its implication for competition.
Okay, let's accept that for purposes of discussion. Who should do it? We no longer have a Civil Aeronautics Board. We have a Department of Transportation.
You should do what?
We have in other words,
the standard?
In other words, if you're saying that the standards of transparency on airline service pricing is inadequate, who would do the regulation in your view?
Well,
do you leave it to Congress?
DOT had a rulemaking which got postponed and postponed and postponed until I think it's now been withdrawn. They've got authority to issue those rules.
So you're saying the authority's there, the will isn't?
That was my sense. I don't know. Others?
We can't ask Kathy this
No.
question. Dorothy, do you have a view?
No, I don't know. I think you have to be wary of unintended consequences. When you first of all, I think you know, I always worry that the discussion of these issues becomes a distraction from the more fundamental issue of infrastructure and other you know, what I view as more serious limitations on competition. But I think you have to be aware of unintended consequences. And the classic example in this context is DOT regulation of or tracking of on-time performance, so that the airlines are now their on-time performance records are very good, but they pad their schedules as a way to ensure that their on-time arrival is good.
So
yes.
I don't see that as a problem. I see that as truth in advertising, right? So I understand that the incentives that it creates, and we can call it padding, but what it's saying is, if I want to know that I'm going to be at my destination by time for a 9 a.m. conference to start, then I want to know really what the airline thinks that its likely arrival rate will guarantee me as the time to arrive. And if I'm early, that's great.
Well,
and if I'm late, it's a problem. And so I'd much rather have them schedule that way. I thought you were going to say what they sometimes seem to do is game right around that 15-minute mark, which there's some interesting economics work that suggests that goes on.
I think schedule padding is not, I mean, if it leads them to be more accurate, but padding implies they're building in some inaccuracy, extra time that they don't think they will need, but they're just in case. And so this is why it is not uncommon now to arrive at an airport and have the pilot tell you our gate is not ready, and then you sit on the tarmac for 15 minutes waiting for your gate to be ready. That's a function of schedule padding. So I don't think it's
partially it's a function of, I think, gate capacity being very, very tight, right?
Yes,
so to go to your other point, I think if the gate capacity were not so valuable, the gate would be ready.
Yeah. Both
but could I just emphasize, and I take your point, we should worry a lot about unintended consequences. I would take an example of this, which is less ancillary fees, but just this pricing transparency, which is my understanding that some airlines are either actively withholding or are considering withholding access to their fare schedule to some of these search engines. And And that's something that makes it more difficult for consumers to search, to discover who's offering the lowest fare. I think part of it is this effort, and I think the fee structure is the same way, to drive consumers directly to the airline site and reduce search, which reduces price competition. And all I'm saying is I think we should be wary of that, just as we should expand infrastructure so that we can ensure access to new entrants. We should be wary of something that's designed to reduce. There may be arguments for it, but we should be wary of it.
I would, there's no way we have enough time, and I'm not sure I have the intellectual capacity to get into the relative economics of a platform like Expedia versus an airline's website. It's a discussion to be done.
Understood.
Yes. I want to raise a couple of more issues for you. You both made the point that one effect of airline deregulation in the United States was a change in the competitive structure outside the United States. However, that change is a long way from as complete as in the United States. So how do you think about the negotiation of open skies agreements? To what extent do you think the government should, and I'll warn you, Richard, this is a question obviously, but also for you. What should, put aside the deregulatory role domestically, how do you encourage competition internationally? Do you take the point that Cliff was thinking about, which is to negotiate cabotage, open skies agreements? Do you think about changes in ownership limitations? How should we get the benefits of competition internationally that we're getting domestically?
Well, I would invest most of my political capital in open skies agreements because much as I think we should eliminate ownership restrictions and restrictions on cabotage, I think they fall in the category of high degree of political difficulty. For U.S. limits foreign ownership by foreign entities to 25% of equity ownership, and a foreign entity cannot have control over the airline. So when Richard Branson wanted to create Virgin America, he could not control it. He had to give up control in order for that to be established. And when the decision Virgin America decided to merge with Alaska Air, he opposed that, but he couldn't do anything about it because he had no control over it. I think that's crazy. I've thought that for a long time. We don't have flag chemical companies. We don't have flag steel companies. Why do we need flag airlines? I mean, I can answer the question, but there's and then cabotage. But there is no political constituency for elimination of restrictions on foreign ownership. The best opportunity was at the point in 2007 where we negotiated the U.S.-EU Open Skies Agreement. Had the EU held out for that, but that did not happen, and so I see no opportunity for that. Similarly, cabotage, I just don't see any. Open skies agreements have been tremendously successful. Cliff, in this study of cabotage, says they've reduced fares. Open skies agreements have reduced fares by 20 to 30%. I think they've been tremendously successful. So that's where I would put the emphasis. We made it a huge push in the Clinton administration. The first open skies agreement with the Netherlands had been negotiated at the tail end of the Bush administration. We made the decision that airline industry, key to the economy, big push on open skies agreements. And I think every administration since then has kept up the pressure.
So I could not agree more with that. I would say, with respect to what we mean by that and sort of what the current political climate is, I'd say two things worry me a lot. One is kind of backdoor effort that I see among the legacy carriers to cabin in, and I'm thinking particularly of the stuff we've been reading in the newspaper about the Gulf carriers' action, which I think is not just about the Gulf carriers, but I think it's about legacy carriers cabining in the remaining domestic airlines that aren't part of these three international alliances to reduce their competition. And I mentioned the problem of domestic feed and international operations and how those two networks are connected in the success of an airline, or the failure, as in the case of TWA and Pan Am. So I think that's a lesson we should learn. The other thing that I think perhaps it's time to re-examine is that in exchange for open skies, the Department of Transportation granted antitrust immunity to a lot of these international alliances. There are now basically three groups, and almost everybody's in one of them. Three's not a lot of competition, if you kind of think that the antitrust immunity is basically turning it into three competitors. I think it's time, from a policy perspective, to re-examine that immunity. I don't know that there's the political appetite for it, but I think if we were trying to think about sort of what's the next frontier for competition internationally, that would be my pitch.
Okay.
I think just I think the really bright light on the horizon in terms of international is the long distance point-to-point competition. Companies like Norwegian Air that are doing in the long distance point-to-point market in the international market what Southwest did domestically. Now, they may run into problems over time, but that's a function of, as so many developments of technology, of new aircraft that allow for smaller aircraft that allow for that sort of long-distance point-to-point competition. But that's a hugely important. Those markets have been ripe for disruption, and that is now happening in a big way.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to warn you in the audience that you will, following the Brookings tradition, you should think about a question to ask. But before we open it up to general questions, I was a junior staffer in the Carter administration, which was famous for not getting things done, even though, in fact, as Dorothy pointed out, it got a lot done. My question is, maybe to Dorothy, but could airline deregulation be enacted today?
I hadn't thought about that till I got your question this morning at 8:30. First, I want an advertisement for Stu Eisenstat's terrific new book on the Carter presidency, which has a long chapter on Carter as the consumer populist that is mostly about deregulation and mostly about airline deregulation. I don't think it could happen today. First of all, there was an unusual confluence of circumstances, macroeconomic ones, very high inflation, high interest rates, and airline deregulation was an answer to that. But I think politically, you're getting more at the politics of it. Airline deregulation, a friend of mine, Jeff Shane, a leading light in international aviation, has referred to it as the public policy equivalent of the bumblebee flying. Just as the bumblebee should not be able to fly, according to the laws of physics, airline deregulation should not have happened according to the laws of politics. As I said earlier, you had strong opposition by the regulated industry and the trade unions. And the public interest, as reflected in this amazing coalition, conservatives, Ralph Nader, American Conservative Union, but their interest was diffuse. And somehow the public interest defeated the entrenched interests. And I am not sure. It had a lot to do with the role of economists, with economists both in the role of academics and actually in the policy realm. I think it was a high watermark for the impact of microeconomics on the policy debate.
I'm going to step out of the moderator's role and say I think it had as much to do with the fact that Senator Edward Moore Kennedy, a liberal Democratic icon, was convinced by his then counsel that this was something which would actually benefit consumers. And it happened to come up at a time when there was galloping inflation.
Yes.
And so it...
Yes. Well, galloping inflation and very high energy prices, which are an important component of airline
Of airline costs, yes.
And of trucking. And I think that was not irrelevant to that pressure as well.
Agreed.
But I agree. I've always thought that was pivotal. But I've also thought at some level that Fred Kahn, by starting to change the rules of the game inside the CAB using the flexibility he had, made it less comfortable for some of the players to sort of continue in that mode, or maybe a flip of it is to say, made some of the incumbent airlines think, you know, I might make more money if I played this game as opposed to the regulation game. So
That's a very good point. And Darius Gaskins did the same thing at the ICC. The FAA did not do that when it came to air traffic control reform. I think they could have. They did not. The Trump administration, the FAA did not do that.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. This is Brookings. Brookings believes that everyone has the right to interrogate experts. However, you start by saying who you are. You ask a question. A question is a statement generally never more than 30 seconds in length that ends with a question mark. Mort.
Mort Downey, a veteran of both Carter and Clinton, worked on deregulation. One of the arguments that was constantly raised with us, we're trying to sell the concept, was it won't be safe. And frankly, we said, yes, it will. The FAA will be on the job. Then I came back 12 years later, and we looked around at what was going on, notably the event that Dorothy mentioned, ValueJet, and said, this is a problem. Then we heard from the FAA, no, it's not. The system is safe. At which point we said, we need to relook. And in fact, they did relook, took a couple of years. It is now much safer than it was before. But how do we do that ahead of time? We can't, I don't think we can let the market deal with safety. I think we have to have some assurance for the public. How do we do that well?
How do we do
Not just true of aviation. Think about natural gas.
Yes. So how do we think about safety regulation as opposed to access regulation?
Well, I agree. That is an inherently governmental function. I think, I think getting the FAA out of the business of air traffic control would allow them to focus on being a safety regulatory agency. I don't know how to answer the question more generally. I mean, the safety record under airline deregulation has been extraordinary. I think a lot of that it has to do with the FAA. I think it has maybe more to do with the improvement in equipment, particularly engines, also aircraft. It reflects a lot of things, and I think the same is true in any other sector.
Yes, sir. In the back.
Can I just,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just say, so I've done some work in my distant past on airline safety, and I don't think there was any indication in any of the statistics that there was a systematic decrease in safety. In fact, if anything, increase, it seems as though. And I just want to highlight that, as Dorothy said, safety regulation didn't change. Maybe FAA attention sort of slipped. If I don't know enough about the ValueJet, I know about the ValueJet crash. I don't know about the FAA investigation of it. But I would say in other industries, so for example, in electric utilities with respect to nuclear power plants, we've seen an increased safety record as the market sale of electricity has been deregulated. So I don't think there should be any presumption that because a product market is competitive, the safety function is impaired. The government's regulatory safety function is impaired.
Hi, I'm Lee Moak. I'm the former president of the Airline Pilots Association. Big fan of deregulation. It's provided competition. We really needed it.
Can you talk louder or into the microphone?
And if we didn't, Lee Moak, former president of Airline Pilots Association. I'm a fan of deregulation. Without it, we wouldn't have healthy, competitive airlines like we have today. But for the panel, how do you reconcile your views on celebrating 40 years of deregulation when during that period of time, we've had over 200 bankruptcies and liquidations in that period, and now it seems like what we're hearing is an advocacy for regulation in the format that you would be picking winners and losers. So how do you reconcile your views on that?
I'm not sure I understand the last part of your question of the advocacy for picking winners and losers.
In regards to you want to regulate slots at airports, you use the term, the labels, legacy, low cost, ultra low cost, when in reality, fuel is a constant, and that relates to costs related to labor on new startups. So how would you reconcile your views on picking winners and losers? Because you seem to come across that way in advocating for that.
So I do not mean to be choosing who wins or loses. I'm merely saying that I think that access to airport infrastructure is really important. I think I will say, and I guess I could use network and non-network carriers, and not all LCCs are actually low cost or low fare. I don't think there's any problem with that. I think what we've got is the market is going to pick the winners and losers as long as we have a level playing field. I will say with respect to bankruptcies, I have a former student who's a professor of finance at Northwestern University, who's done some interesting work on the intersection between capital market structures and labor. And in part, this work came out of discussions that he and I had about the airline industry, and a question as to whether some airlines were using high degrees of leverage to give themselves an advantage in bargaining with their unions, suggesting that the bankruptcies may be, in fact, an outcome that they're willing to tolerate because it lets them squeeze more out of labor. That's not something that I'm advocating as a strategy or that I would necessarily weigh in on at all, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis, and he finds at least some suggestive evidence across industries that where unions are strong, companies may be leveraging up as a way of saying to their labor, we can't pay higher wages, we don't have free cash. So I don't know if that's an interaction with some of the labor issues or not, but it's an interesting hypothesis.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Charlie Leoka. I run Travelers United. To your question that you asked, who would take care of ancillary fees and regulating that kind of material? It clearly falls under the Department of Transportation, and it comes under the category of unfair and deceptive practices. I think that a lot of what we end up with is there are two different ways for deregulation, or deregulation only works when we have transparency. And by eliminating ancillary fees from all of the pricing, we don't have anything going on. So, I mean, that's answering your question. And then when we look at the overall section, we've got someone from antitrust as well here. And we got to the discussion about the airline slots. How does DOJ fit into the question of airline slots outside of a merger? And do you see them, because we've got big problems in New York and DCA, we had a merger that fixed a lot of those. But do you think the DOJ has a role to play in dealing with airline slots, and do you think the DOJ has any role to play in dealing with ATI, with international sides?
Sure. So on the question about airline slots, I think I could point you to both mergers where we have, as a remedial tool, sought divestiture of airline slots, in part to remedy the anticipated anti-competitive effects of a merger. So we might, there can be a role for slot divestitures in connection with transactions. We were talking a bit before about the case that Nancy and I worked on together at Newark Airport, which was a slot transaction, and we have the ability to challenge a slot transaction. And so where, in that case and in other cases where there's a dominant carrier at the airport and the transaction promises to entrench or fortify that dominant carrier's position, there is the ability to sue to enjoin that under the antitrust laws, and we've done that in the past, and I imagine that we would, in the right circumstances, be willing to do that in the future. Of course, we don't regulate slots, and so FAA, DOT, they're really the regulators here, but there is, setting aside antitrust enforcement, there is room, it would seem, for some regulatory reform that could encourage more efficient slot usage and gate usage, frankly.
Great.
I don't know if that's helpful.
We have time for one more. The gentleman, yes. Before we started this, I said to Anna, "You're giving us an awful long time to talk." I was wrong. I just want to say that for the record.
Thank you. I'm Alex Rolfe, a frequent traveler between Atlanta and the New York area. I am into LaGuardia because of its historical placement from the 1920s. I know we can't change locations of airports typically, but very cognizant that my flight often is faster than the time it takes me to get into city centers where I travel, and also aware that in the 60s and 70s there was much more robust helicopter transportation between these points at a reasonable price. Is there any interest or history of the airline industry investing in some of the emergent technologies to take away friction in that process? And one of those being replacements for helicopters, drones that can carry passengers from these locations, a la the Pan Am building in Midtown Manhattan, which is no longer an option for consumers.
Anybody want to?
Do you know about that?
I don't. Richard's nodding, so my inclination is to. But it does prompt me to say something that I didn't get a chance to say, and that is, I think technology is a game changer, and it's why I'm always loath to lock in on particular policy solutions. I mean, we worried a whole lot about computer reservation systems, and so did DOJ. Who even uses that term any longer? I was talking to somebody, an airport consultant yesterday, who said the biggest problem airports face now is that all this new parking they've built is sitting empty because everybody shows up in an Uber or a Lyft. So that is there is now a service, Kiwi.com, that allows you to do your own international interline fare, and there are airports that will provide insurance, so if you miss a flight, you're guaranteed a seat on. I mean, the technology is bringing on new solutions, and so we need to be careful, whether it's airport planning or public policy, about assuming that current technology is going to persist.
So
Yeah.
I thought what you were going to say is it's not just airport and air traffic control infrastructure that we have underinvested in.
Yes, that's true.
And I think I completely share your experience, particularly in the New York area. I think it's symptomatic of an underinvestment in infrastructure for surface transportation as well, or as you're more imaginatively suggesting, perhaps it's not surface, but I think it's part of a just generic problem that we have in this country with having underinvested in infrastructure.
All right, let us move to hear the people who actually do provide the services view of this. Let us thank the panel, please.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.